So that is the first aspect of why military aid to Israel doesn't work, according to President Obama's criteria. We can't afford it. Number two, it doesn't work because it certainly does not promote a just and lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians, which, after all, is the objective of the Obama administration. And in fact, you can bring up with your members of Congress a 2009 Amnesty International report which said that U.S. arms transfers to Israel are literally fueling the conflict. And they're literally fueling the conflict because, I kid you not, the United States has provided hundreds of millions of dollars worth of aviation jet fuel to Israel in the past several years to literally fly the jets and the helicopters and so forth. So these weapons are literally fueling the conflict. Now, the other point that you can raise with them is that there are strict conditions on how U.S. weapons can be used by a foreign country. And these are encapsulated in the Arms Export Control Act, which set out two and only two possible reasons or uses that a foreign country can have for employing U.S. weapons. Does anyone know what those two are?
Self-defense.
I heard self-defense, okay. And?
Use within the borders of your legal country.
Yes. The way it's phrased in the law is internal security or legitimate self-defense. And the key emphasis here is on legitimate. Now let's just say a word about each in terms of how you can frame these issues for your member of Congress. Can anyone explain to me how, when Israel uses U.S. weapons for a foreign military occupation of the Palestinian West Bank, East Jerusalem, or Gaza Strip, it's internal security? It can't possibly be for internal security because it's being used for an illegal foreign military occupation. So right off the bat, according to the U.S.'s own definition, Israel shouldn't be using these weapons to perpetuate a foreign military occupation. Number two, and yes, you can always get into debates about what constitutes self-defense, and of course Israel, like every other country in the world, has the right of self-defense. The key thing to emphasize here is what constitutes legitimate self-defense. And it's never legitimate self-defense to intentionally injure and kill civilians. It's never legitimate self-defense to intentionally destroy civilian infrastructure. It's never legitimate self-defense to blockade a people and deny them access to the humanitarian provisions that they need for everyday life in violation of the Geneva Conventions. So don't get bogged down in a debate about whether Israel is acting in self-defense. The important point is that the law is on your side, because it has to be legitimate self-defense, and human rights violations and international law violations, and certainly war crimes and crimes against humanity, are never legitimate self-defense. So what we're asking you to do with these talking points is to give your members of Congress this memo, which is the second item in your left side packet. It's called Leveraging the 2011 Budget Request for Military Aid to Achieve U.S. Policy Goals. We're asking members of Congress to make some specific amendments to this year's budget to restrict and condition U.S. military aid to Israel to prevent the types of human rights abuses that have taken place in the past. Let me just briefly go over some of these possible amendments that the members of Congress could offer. Number one, restricting Israel's use of weapons to its own sovereign territory. Now, of course, you're going to hear the minute you bring this up, well, Israel faces an existential threat from Iran. Don't go down that path in terms of debating that question. That's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about violations of Palestinian human rights with U.S. weapons. And what you can say is, look, maybe Israel does have legitimate self-defense reasons, and maybe there are even legitimate self-defense reasons for U.S. weapons, but let's figure out a way that we can restrict the use of these weapons in a way that doesn't commit human rights abuses against Palestinians. And there actually is precedent for restricting the use of U.S. aid to within Israel and keeping it out of the occupied Palestinian territories. So what I did was I took the exact same language that's in the legislation on loan guarantees and asked them to stipulate that U.S. military aid should only be used in geographic areas subject to the administration of the government of Israel before June 5th, 1967. That's the exact language that's already in the law on loan guarantees. If it applies to loan guarantees, why shouldn't it apply to foreign aid, military aid as well, especially when that's what the Arms Export Control Act says in the first place. Number two, Zahir and Noura talked about the fact that there has been no accountability for prior misuses and violations of U.S. law. Another amendment that you can ask members of Congress to make to the budget is to say that we need a report on previous violations before we're going to give any more money. Letter B, promoting a freeze on the expansion of Israeli settlements. This is obviously a top priority of the Obama administration, one that it has failed to implement. We have a helpful suggestion for how to help the Obama administration get to its policy goal. And that's exactly the way that you should frame it. We say that, like every other country receiving military aid, instead of giving it to Israel in one lump sum at the beginning of the fiscal year, let's break it into quarterly disbursements. And before any money can be dispersed, let's have the Obama administration send Congress a report verifying that no settlement expansion has taken place in the previous quarter. That should appeal to a lot of members of Congress who are already on our side in terms of understanding that the expansion of settlements is wrong. Finally, C would be asking for some additional reporting requirements. This is very, very typical. And if you look at U.S. aid to Palestinians, you will find that it is the most restricted, most conditioned form of U.S. aid amongst any country or people in the entire world. Well, so let's get some balance. You know, we always hear balance. Let's get some balance and say let's get a reporting requirement, because President Obama has said that the blockade of Gaza should be lifted. He said it when he appointed George Mitchell his special envoy for Middle East peace, and I have the quote on the talking points of exactly what he said. We want members of Congress to offer an amendment saying before any money is dispersed, we want a report from the President verifying that the blockade of Gaza has been lifted and that humanitarian aid and regular trade has been restored. So these are some of the types of amendments that you can ask members of Congress to make. Now, most of them are going to say, we're not on the Appropriations Committee, so you should talk to the people on the Appropriations Committee. They're really just trying to divert your attention, because any member of Congress can offer an amendment to the budget when it gets to the floor for a vote. So you can recognize that they may not be on the committee that can offer amendments at the beginning of the process, but they can certainly do it towards the end.